Okay, so tonight we're back in the Signer kitchen and we're making biscuits. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our oven temperature to bake at 425. Okay, while the oven is preheating, I'll go over what we've got set up here. Okay, here we have flour, we have a little bit of salt, we have baking powder, we have sugar, we have about 12 ounces of milk, and we will also be using cold butter. Now I just removed this from the refrigerator because it's very important that it be cold when we start our recipe because that will make our biscuits flaky. We also have a bowl that we'll be mixing everything in. We have a pastry cutter that will allow us to cut this butter into the flour mixture. If you don't have a pastry cutter, you can use a fork. We will be sifting all of our dry ingredients together. This is a sifter, a little bit of older sifter, and it will allow us to get any lumps out of the flour. Once we have everything mixed together, we're going to bring our mixture over to our next station. Here we have a floured surface. This is just a large glass cutting board. It could be anything, but that's what I'm using. If you don't have a large glass cutting board, you could also put a sheet of parchment paper out and flour that. So I floured that. I have a biscuit cutter, which this is actually just a cookie cutter, circle shape. I have a small rolling pin, and I have a very small spatula just in case I need to lift the biscuits from this to the pan. Here I have a baking sheet with parchment paper in the bottom, and I have an egg wash ready to put egg wash on top of the biscuits before they go into the oven. Lastly, once the biscuits are done, and it takes about 10 to 12 minutes for the biscuits to complete, I have a cooling rack just on top of a baking sheet to make sure we catch any crumbs. All right, so that's what we have set up. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to put our sifter in here, and this is going to be a bit of a process because this recipe makes approximately, well, the original recipe makes 36 biscuits. I halved it, so this should make 18. That's still quite a few. So we have a fair amount of sifting to do. Okay, I'm going to start by just sifting the flour in here. We'll add some of the other dry ingredients in a minute. And we'll throw in a little bit of salt. And again, this is just to get any of the clumps out. And we'll throw in some baking powder. Try to get it in between all this stuff. All right, it's one batch. Okay, set this down for just a second. Now this is all-purpose flour. Very important not to get self-rising. Self-rising flour already has the salt and baking powder in it. So if you added more salt and baking powder, your ratios would not be correct. So this recipe uses all-purpose flour, which does not have the salt or the baking powder added. So I'm just going to finish those up. Put that off to the side. Nice fine mixture. Okay, spread that out a little bit. Now we will be using our hands for mixing. Very important when you mix biscuits that you use a very light touch. The more you mix and the more you knead, the flatter your biscuits will be because you'll basically be taking all of the air or rise out of the biscuits. So you want to use a very light touch, just enough to get everything mixed up. All right, we're almost done sifting. Next step will be to cut our butter into the mixture. Now this recipe uses unsalted butter. If you went to the store and you picked up salted butter by accident, again, that would change the ratios, so you would want to make sure that you did not add additional salt. All right, so now everything's been sifted. I'm going to add my butter. Stop. Okay, you'll notice that I have sort of pre-cubed this. That's just to help it along in terms of cutting it in. And we want to spread it out a little bit too, so it's not all in one spot. Now, some biscuit recipes use shortening or lard. So depending upon what fat you use, that impacts the flavor of the biscuits. All right. And traditionally people used, what was available. So see a lot of older recipes, especially older Southern recipes, use lard. People were on farms, they had lard available, so that's what they used. And it makes for a very flaky biscuit. All right, so this biscuit cutter is basically breaking the fat up. And what we're looking for, let me get these clumps off of here, is to incorporate this into the flour, and it should make sort of a mealy consistency. Not looking for smooth, we're looking for very small little balls. So we'll continue to cut this in until we see that. Now, if your butter is not cold, then you will not achieve the mealy consistency that you're looking for. And then that will result in some harder, flatter biscuits. They will not rise the way they should. So again, very important to use cold butter when doing this. And we're working our way around the bowl. I still see some larger pieces in there, and you see some pieces getting attached to the pastry cutter here. So clear those off a little bit. Keep working it. This is essentially the same process, different proportions, that you use when making a pie shell. So if you've ever made a homemade pie shell, very similar process. All right, looks like we're getting there. We still have a couple of clumps, so we're going to go do this maybe a few more times, but you can see getting fewer and fewer of those big clumps. And just because I have a bowl with sort of square edges here, I'm going to move some of this flour into the center to make sure it's all getting incorporated. Fat is evenly distributed. Turn my bowl a bit. So I have a couple of large clumps, but we're getting there. It's looking good. Now in a minute, we'll be adding a cup and a half or 12 ounces of milk to this mixture. And I'll show you a little trick that'll make that a little easier that I learned from my mother. Now we're using whole milk. A lot of people use buttermilk. I wouldn't suggest using 2% or 1% or skim milk. It doesn't have the same proportion of fat and could affect, again, the taste and the rise of the biscuits. This particular recipe called for whole milk, so that's what we're using. Again, very common that you'll see buttermilk. Alright, I think we're just about there. I'm just doing a quick check, feeling around to make sure I don't have any sort of loose flour. Now I have, this pastry cutter that I have is an older pastry cutter. It can be a little bit more difficult to find these days. If you don't have one, then like I said, you can use a fork, or you can use 2 butter knives and use sort of a crisscross cutting method to cut in the butter, and I think we have it. Alright, I'll put that there. Now, this is what my mother and from my grandmother taught me. Basically, you create a well or a hole in the center of the flour that you're going to pour your milk into. And then makes it easier to pull the flour in from the sides and get it incorporated with fewer strokes than might otherwise be required. So again, very carefully, easily incorporating this liquid into the batter. It is going to get stuck all over your fingers. Don't worry about it. We'll get it off. All right. Now what you're trying to do is, you're not trying to knead it as much as you are trying to look for dry spots. I see some there, so again, easy, light movements, trying to get that liquid incorporated. Got some wetter parts on my fingers here, so I'm going to use that. Pull those off, trying to move them to the bottom. Pull from underneath, pull it over to the top, because I've got some loose flour underneath, and that's the loose flour mixture that I'm trying to get incorporated into my biscuits. It's almost there. What you're going to end up with is a nice little blob. Oops, get back in here. And hopefully a limited amount of loose flour still remaining in your bowl. Okay. And I think we've about got it. All right, I'm just going to clean my fingers off just a little bit, and then we're going to move it over to the floured surface that we prepared earlier. All right, here we go. Now, I'm going to turn it out to the floured surface. We see there's still a little bit of loose flour in the bottom. That's okay. I'm going to incorporate that in. Get everything out of the bowl there, I think. Alright. Put that bowl in the sink. Get some flour. And again, we're not trying to over knead the dough. What we're trying to do is to sort of get it to stick together. And a nice blob. Now, this one, I'll take some of this off my fingertips here, is a little bigger than we need. So we're going to half it. First, I'm just going to get some of this off. So I'm going to there we go. And then I'm going to cut it out in half so that I can work with half the dough at a time. All right, I still have my bowl over here, so I'm going to set this in the bowl. It's right there. All right, I got a little bit more flour. On the surface. And I need some flour on my rolling pin. Now I use a very small rolling pin, just my preference. It's going to be a light touch. We are going for about a ½ inch thickness. Any thinner than that and our biscuits will be flat. All the way to the end there. Let's move this off to the side. Yeah, let's move that. Roll it out sideways just a bit. I'm just looking at the depth there. Alright, I think we got about the right thickness. Now, I want to make sure that our biscuit cutter is floured. Now, I have a cookie cutter that is a circle shape, so that's what I'm using. If you don't, you could use a jar lid, for example, anything that is a good circle shape. Now, our text mentions that if you put your biscuits a little closer together, then that will help them rise and have sort of nicer sides. So we're going to do 3 across. Trying to cut our circles as close together as possible so that we can minimize the amount of leftover dough. We'll have some left over, and you can roll this out a second time, but it will have more flour in it, and it may not rise as much. Oops, that one didn't come out. There we go. I think, not sure, huh? Can get one more in there, I think. Oops, it's a little bit of an odd shape, but that's okay. That one's not quite round, it's okay. All right, we're gonna move our scraps to the side, and we'll roll out the second half of our dough. Okay. There's a scrap. I'm gonna reflour the surface a bit. There's the second half of our dough. This time we're going to try to get a shape that will let us do 3 cloths so that we don't have so much waste. Alright, again, the rolling pin in the flour. get it a little wider this time. Okay. Now I'm just working around the dough, trying to get it an even thickness of about a 1/2 inch. And I think we're there. Just about the one spot right there. Okay. Get our cutter and get some more biscuits. Let's see if we can put these closer together. Just going to slide these a little closer to see if I can get that last row in. Yeah, I think we can. Alright, now, before we put them in, we're going to put a light egg wash on them. This will help them brown on the top. This is 2 eggs and 2 tablespoons of water mixed together. So for every egg, it's 1 tablespoon of water. That's how you make an egg wash. And it just helps the biscuits have a nice brown top. You can also put butter on them when they first come out. Almost there. There's our oddly shaped biscuit. That'll be our test biscuit. Cut into it later to make sure it's done. Now the key here is uniformity. You want all of your biscuits to be about the same thickness and the same size so that you can judge how long they need to cook. You don't have to worry about inconsistencies in size affecting the cooking time. Alright, that was the last one. Now we're going to put our biscuits in the oven. Okay. And I'm going to get to this side of the rack. Alright, so it's going to cook for about 10 to 12 minutes. We're going to check it about the 5-minute mark. Let's look at the time now. According to our microwave clock, it is 6:28. So we'll be checking it again about 6:33, just to kind of check on the progress and make sure that it is rising the way we expect. All right, I'll see you then.